Mr. Speaker, this past June, the Canadian Parliament agreed on something very important, which was the UN Resolution 1973, which talked about the need to bring an international human rights response with our allies because of the murder regime that Gadaffi had, the attacks on people in the communities. The threat that rape was being used as a weapon of war was raised in this House by the New Democratic Party, and we put that into our motion of support. It's the first time that rape as a weapon of war has been recognized in a parliamentary debate on taking on international war criminals. So we did something very profound. But at the time, Mr. Speaker, there was a number of people in Canada and certainly within our party who were very concerned that this would be misinterpreted as a mandate for regime change. And there's a fundamental difference between the international community coming together to protect civilians and to create the civilian enclaves and seeing that as a mandate to begin regime change, because certainly we would see the necessity then for regime change in many countries. We see the murderous regime in Syria. There's not a comment from the government. And yet now that the regime has fallen, there's a need for the international community to begin the important work of rebuilding. But we see from this government the continual talk of punching above our weight, the militaristic talk. I heard my colleague from Selkirk Interlake use the old, tired Conservative slogan, "We don't cut and run." Now, my colleague's from farm country, so he probably doesn't know what cut and run means. Cut and run is a nautical term. It means if your ship is going to hit the rocks, you have to cut the anchor and run with the wind, otherwise you go straight into the rocks. But we don't hear that kind of nuance from the Conservatives because their plan is always to go straight into the rocks. Mr. Speaker, I speak on this because I was raised by my grandmother who has never got over the horror of the Somme and the fact that every boy on her street died fighting for the British Army on the Somme. And she said to me again and again as a little boy, she said, "Charlie, always watch the politicians who will get young boys killed." There's a sort of puffery in a way we talk about our allies. And I think of the great Prime Minister Cameron, who came here and spoke of the international community standing up against a murderous regime in Libya. And yet just last year, it was the British regime who was courting Gadaffi and signing deals. In fact, I was just reading an article in the Telegraph. It said how Britain courted, armed, and trained a Libyan monster. That as recently as June 16, 2010, they were inviting Gaddafi's notorious son, Camus, to special invitations to celebrate the birthday of Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. While they were feting Gaddafi and treating him royally, they were also signing arms deals so that he could oppress and he could kill his own people. That's the reality of international affairs, and we have to start being more honest in this House of Commons when we talk about our role in the international community with our allies in terms of dealing with murderous regimes like Gaddafi. So now Gaddafi has been beaten, the people have risen up, and we see the governments of the United States, the governments of England, and the Conservative government of Canada saying, this is an example of how we always stand with our allies, when in fact, year after year, they promoted Gaddafi, they gave him the arms to oppress his people. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't have anything against Mr. Cameron coming into this House and pretending that he's always been against murderous regimes like Gaddafi when that wasn't the case. I have a problem, though, Mr. Speaker, that this House seems obsessed in the Liberal Party and their interventionist approach with the Conservatives, is that by us raising the issue that we need to move away from a military mission at this point and use Canada's extraordinary ability to rebuild, the expertise that we bring in international development, in terms of international justice. We've been leaders on this, that this is where we need to move now. That this is somehow, by the member of Toronto Centre who's taken on the mantle of the former Mr. Ignatieff and the Conservative, that this is a sign that we are cutting and running, and this is somehow a slight to our brave men and women in uniform. And Mr. Speaker, I do have to say that I always find it deeply odious that this government always has to say that they're the only ones who care for our men and women in uniform. Our men and women in uniform go to do a specific job. The regime has fallen. We were not signed on UN Resolution 1973 anywhere does it say that our job was there for regime change. This was a fight between the Libyan people, and our job as the international community was to go in and make sure that Gaddafi's thugs, who at that time, of course, were well armed by the British military, were not killing innocent civilians. So that phase has ended. That obligation to that mission has ended. So the question is, where do we go as a parliament? And I think it is incumbent for Canada to stand up and show that it stands for something more than just this sort of attempt to recreate the old Cold War militarism. That Canada has been an international peacemaker. That Canada had an international reputation before this government came along. And in Libya today, we have the opportunity to be the good community, to be the good international citizen. And I'm calling on this Parliament to take that step, to say that this fight in Libya has now moved to a new place, and we need a country that is willing to step up. But you're not going to see that, Mr. Speaker. That's why you're hearing the heckling from the Conservative backbenches. It doesn't, you know, these are the same guys who called Jack Layton Taliban Jack when Jack spoke 6, 7 years ago of the fundamental failure of the Conservative policy in Afghanistan. And now we see that their failed policy is still that the United States is now trying to go into negotiations. War is not a simple thing, Mr. Speaker. People are hurt. People are killed. And we're at the point now in this conflict where we need the international community to change gears. Because if we try and misrepresent UN Resolution 1973 and say that this was all a covert plan for regime change, then it sets a very dangerous international precedent. It sets the precedent that the United States set for Iraq, and we saw the disastrous consequences there, Mr. Speaker. Our country's foreign policy is not about taking out any dictator just any time we want. That does not meet the test of the rule of law. So what we agreed to in this House was to protect the civilian populations who are under the threat of the Gadaffi regime. That threat is now ended. This is the final mop-up. We have to move on as a parliament, and this is why the New Democrats are moving forward our amendment to move us towards the humanitarian phase and the rebuilding phase of this situation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Come